Hello everybody, it's a common question, so I'm keen to cover it. Main menus, specifically VR main menus using VR user interface, so VR UI. So what we're going to cover very quickly, adding a main menu as a new scene, setting the build order, changing the scene on a button press on that main menu to take you to your main game, and then what we're also going to do is a bit of a recap as well as to how you can make other scenes potentially for win or lose screens. So let's get straight into it. I've got my project set up here, which is based on the boxing tutorial you may have already seen. What we're keen to do here is to make it so, well, there's a main menu. Currently, if I go to File and Build Settings, you will see that I've got no scenes currently in my build. There are nothing in my build order, so we're going to go and create some scenes. I've got this existing scene here, which is currently called, if you don't know how to find out where this is the project of VR template 2022.3.9-copy. So that's the name of the project. And then main game in this case is the name of the scene. So that helps me find this scene if I'm a little bit lost later on. So if I were to search for main game, you can see that there's a scene there. And if I were to close down the search with that selected, it'll show me that it's in the scenes folder in assets, which is where most of your scenes will probably be. So I've got a folder here for scenes. That's my main game. First thing I want to do is go to File and Build Settings, and I'm going to make sure that that scene is in my build settings. They're ready to be created. But what we obviously want to do is to make a new scene to work as our main menu. So I'm going to right click anywhere in this empty space. I'm going to create a new scene. And this scene is going to be called main menu. If you double click on that, what you will see is it will take you to exactly the same place in this new scene. So you see that the camera position doesn't change. I'm still pointing the same direction, my virtual camera, my edit camera. And this can sometimes be a bit confusing if you zoom really, really far away in your new scene, perhaps look a different direction, and then you return to your main menu, or your main game, I should say, you'll notice that you're still pointing the other direction. And sometimes you have to double click on an object to have it zoom in back to where you were. So sometimes that can be a bit confusing. First thing to appreciate about your VR main menus is that they behave differently to what you may expect from a regular main menu. This is not a screen we're creating here. You are creating a virtual space where your player can interact with main menus in front of them. So first thing to keep in mind, if I double click on the main camera, is this main camera will not work in VR. It just won't. If I were to press play and look around, it won't work. So delete your main camera, and you can keep your directional light. Maybe it's not appropriate in this scene, it's entirely up to you. But what I'm going to do is to create a new game object, and I'm going to use XR. Really important you choose XR, and from here I'm going to choose a UI canvas from XR. Not the UI canvas, this is really misleading. You want the XR one, and you want a UI canvas, because that will also create an event system for you that works with VR, and it will also create a canvas that is set to world space. It currently doesn't know where our camera is because we don't have a camera that will work. But here is our canvas that we're going to populate in a second. We need a character as well that can work in VR. You can find that in the asset space. In here, if you go into the samples folder, XR interaction toolkit, if you've upgraded this, it may be a slightly different number, or it may still be 2.5.1 or whatever. I can't remember what we set up, but go into the folder that's in there. Starter assets, and then in there your prefabs. It's the XR interaction setup prefab that we want, so I'm going to drag and drop that into the hierarchy space, which will put it at the 0, 0, 0 position. If you instead put it in your scene like this, just make sure its position is set to 0, 0, 0. What you can then do is move this object either a little bit further backwards relative to your canvas, or you can move your canvas a little bit further forward. First thing is that your canvas will be huge. So I've got the canvas and I'm going to shrink it down using the scale tool. So that's that one there, remember? Shrink, 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 shrink. And I'm going to put that a little bit in front of our player. And if I go into the game window, we can see that there's nothing there at the moment. We can see our two little virtual poke interactors. But what we're going to do on our canvas is we're going to make a right click on the canvas, and now we can use the UI tools we're used to. Things like a piece of text, or for our purposes, a button. The button may be really large as well, so I'm going to scale that down. And a button has got a child, which is a piece of text, which you can change what it says. Start game. You can change the colour, you can change the font, but I will do another tutorial at some point about changing custom fonts in TextMesh Pro because it's not straightforward. You can centre align it, you can right align it, you can change what it does. If you want to change the properties of the button itself, let's say you want to change the colour, well there's all the colours for the default colour, have you hovered over it, are you clicking it? All those properties are there. You can also change the source image if you wanted it to not have rounded edges, for example. Change the source image to be none and it will be completely around the edges. Or I'm just going to pick some random icons I've got here and a thumbs up. You can see that it's stretched, or the HMD. You get the idea. It's just an icon. I'm going to go back to using the UI sprite because that's got excuse me, that's got the rounded edges. But ultimately we've got that. I'm also going to right click on the canvas and I'm also going to create a piece of UI which is a text using TextMesh Pro. Scale that down and that could be the title for our game. I'm going to move that up. When duty calls, or whatever you wanted to call it. You can use this tool here, the rect tool, to change the size of your text box on your canvas. And you want to grab the blue anchor points. You don't want to use these, they're your margins, so don't use the little squares in the middle, use the little blue spheres on the corners, they're far better. Now if I go into the game view, I should, when I press play, as long as this is in front of me, be able to see that, as long as I've positioned that in such a way that it's in front of me. Okay, if I'm having a look around at the minute, I can see that it's all the way over there because I've positioned it in the wrong place. So my first test here is it visible? Is it in the correct location? And in this case, for me, it wasn't. So I'm going to grab the canvas and I'm going to change its position on the X, Y and Z to be 0, 0, 0. That's exactly where the player is, but I moved my player back a little bit. So now I can see that that's there, but obviously that looks really dull as a main menu because I've got, well, the default skybox. So what I'm going to do on the canvas is right click, create a UI element which will be a panel. I do like panels. And a panel is by default a semi-transparent thing. So you can set it to black, you can change the alpha value, but notice what's happening to the text. It's gone invisible. What you want is any text or buttons that are on panels must be children of the panels, otherwise they will appear below it. So what we're going to do is grab the button, make that a child of the panel. Now the button's obviously visible. Do the same for text, make that a child of the panel, and you can now see that that's displaying correctly. I would always do a test at this stage to see, can I hover over it with the controllers? So I've got my controller which is there. Can I hover over it? Can I press it? So I'm using the trigger. You'll notice that the A or the B buttons, they don't do anything. It's all based on the trigger. And you've got your Ray interactor, which is how we're going to interact with it. Obviously we've still got the skybox around us and the player can move because that's what's set up. And if you move, you fall. So we need to think about creating this as a complete space where our player is going to be. I always recommend just creating like a little box for them or a space for your player to be, or if you just wanted to disable the player's ability to move, go into the interaction setup, go into the XR origin, go into the locomotion system, and there's your movement. If you don't want to be able to move, let's change it. Let's set our move speed to 0. If you don't want to be able to turn, you can disable this. And remember, this is unique to this scene. Whatever changes you make to your player here won't affect your player in the other main game or anything like that. Just make sure we are recording, always good. It's also worth remembering that if you've got interesting design principles here, there's nothing that says all of your buttons need to be on one piece of canvas. You can make many canvases if you want. So what I'm going to do here is make a duplicate of that canvas with Control D, and I'll put that over here. Maybe have another one over here. Maybe one could have high scores on it. Maybe one could have credits. Maybe one could have information about the game or when the release date is going to be, all sorts of stuff. Just because this is obviously in VR and we're going to be looking at it like this, I quite like to rotate these things. So I'm going to grab that canvas, rotate it, that canvas, rotate it, and I'm going to move both of them a little bit further forward, just so it lines up and feels a little bit more like a series of screens. And let's just see what that looks like. Obviously, all of these buttons will be doing nothing at the minute. We haven't told them to, but the player should not be able to move. So I'm going to use the left thumbstick. Oh, okay. That's why we test. So back to our movement. We don't want gravity. We don't want strafe. Our move speed is 0. Again, just testing it, but you can just delete the move instruction. I think that will also work. But you always test. But what I always recommend is creating a space for the player to be in as well, like many of you have already done. So all I'm going to do is just create a simple plane, put that in the middle of our world, 0, 0, 0, and have this be a floor for us. Scale it up as big as you want, slap a material on it. And if you wanted walls around your player, well, duplicate that, rotate it 90 degrees. You get the idea. You could easily make a space. I'm not going to complete this entire thing. It's a box. Have fun making a box. You get the idea. You can make a space. But obviously be aware that your player can turn around. If you don't disable movement, your player could potentially walk off the edge of your map or fall, as we saw earlier. So it's something I really want you to take on board. So what we've got currently is we've got our main menu, which we've created, and now we're going to go and put that into our build settings. So file and build settings. Currently we've got main game as the only thing that's in there. We're going to go into our scenes and we're going to add the main menu. Notice the build order's currently wrong. We want our main menu to load before our main game. So let's swap it. When you press play in the editor, it'll open whatever scene is currently open. When you make a build, see my other video about how to make a build, by the way, guys. When you make a build, it will load in the build order you have created, which is why it's important. Here's the main thing that now everyone wants to know. How do I make this button start the game? I'm going to delete the other canvases for now for simplicity. But all we're going to have is this button is going to take us to our scene that we've got. Naming's really important here. So notice how this is called main space game with a capital M and a capital G. Same for main menu, because if you change the name, your script is going to break. I like to make this script on the canvas. It doesn't matter what object it is on. I like to put it on the primary canvas. Okay, doesn't matter. We're going to make a thing here called change scene. Remember, you can't put spaces in there, so I've called it change scene, all one word, with a capital C and a capital S. That's a new script which we're going to open in Visual Studio. All this is going to do is to be a custom function that will say when I don't even need to tell it for things like on click or anything. I don't want the start or the update function, so I can delete all of that, leaving the bottom squiggly bracket. What I want is a public void, which I'm going to call load main game. I'm going to put a capital M there just because it's tidy. Once we've loaded the main game, all this is going to do is to call the scene manager, SCENE manager, dot load scene, and then in brackets, in double quotes, you write the name of the scene you want to load. Notice how this is also pulled in the necessary import at the top, the using scene management. So what we want to do is to load the main space game, spelled exactly like that, semicolon at the end of the line to say that you're done. Save it, back to Unity. And now what we want to do is to click on the button. We're not choosing the text on the button, we're choosing the button because the button has a button component and an on-click function, event I should say. What happens when we click it? So we add an event. We tell it to look on the canvas by dragging the canvas in that slot. We don't drag the script that changes our scene, we drag the object that's got the script on it. Then you choose the function. We've got this change scene script, and on there we've got a function called load main game. So what should now happen is when we interact with that by left clicking on it with the trigger, it should load the main game, is what we expect. As long as we spelled everything correctly, I can't imagine any reason why this wouldn't work. There we go. We can see that as the cursor hovers over it, we press it, we let go, and it loads our main game. So what we've just covered is adding our main menus, creating our build order and editing that through there, and changing the scene on a button press or interaction with the button. Just really quickly, I'm going to give you some other options you might want to consider. Maybe your main menu doesn't use UI. If it is going to, you can turn off now, done, that's all you're going to need. But maybe you wanted it for the player to reach an object and physically touch it. Or maybe we want a object that the player could grab. I'm just going to put it straight in front of them, and I'm going to put a blue material on it so it's obvious. If I were to put an XR simple interactable on there, and if I go to the interactable events, we can say when we hover over it, when we select it, when we grab it, when we do whatever. So I'm going to say on select, look on the canvas, because on the canvas you will find a script called change scene, and on there you will find a function called load main game. And that will happen when I have selected, i.e. grabbed this object. Let's see what this does. So obviously I've got my button there, and now doing the same to this cube should do the same thing. So I'm going to use the grip button for this, and that loaded it. So maybe you in your game want to be able to reach out and grab an object, or maybe in your game you decide you don't want to use the ray interactors at all. So if I go to the camera offset, left controller, maybe you want to deactivate the ray interactor by turning it off. And you can do that for left and right, so the player has to physically grab stuff. One last thing I wanted to show you is how you can transition between scenes by having the player walk into a zone. This might be useful for a win scene. So I'm going to create a new scene, which I'm going to call win. This would also work for lose, but you get the idea. Remember that if it's not in your build settings, it doesn't exist. So drag it into your build settings. And what we now want, just going to do a quick save. What we now want to do is in our main game, I'm just going to create a cube, which we can position anywhere we want. And this is going to represent a zone our player needs to walk into to win the game. I'm going to make it visible, but you can make it invisible by turning off the mesh renderer and just being left with the box collider. The box collider needs to be a trigger, and you can obviously scale this to be as big or as small as you like. I'm going to make a new script for this, but you could recycle an existing one. Oh no, let's use our existing one. So we've already got our change scene. No, let's not do that. I'm going to make a new thing, and I'm going to call this win game. New script called win game, capital W, capital G. And the job of win game is when you enter in the trigger zone, you go to your win screen. So let's delete our start and our update loops. On trigger enter. So we've walked into the trigger zone. What do we want to do? We want to check if the thing that entered in the trigger zone, so if the other thing that entered in the trigger zone had a tag, and that tag was player, then we're going to, well, call the scene manager and tell it to load a scene, just like we did before. And the scene we want to load is called win. Obviously, we need to make sure that our player object, our XR interaction setup, we need to make sure that the XR origin has the tag of player. Otherwise, this won't work. And obviously, we could make that box invisible, we could make it glow, we could do whatever we liked with it. But, oh, there you go. If I walk into this zone, let's see what happens. We walk into it, and I've gone to our win screen. Notice I've not put the player's camera in here. This is just the standard camera. I look around, and obviously the camera is not following me. So we need to make sure the win screen also had that XR interaction setup, and not just the default standard camera. That's everything from me for this tutorial, but hopefully that's been quite useful for you to set up all the basics of things like main menus. Thank you.